Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to get a slug of coffee, get a little caffeine in your system, because we have saved the best for last. I'm not going to spend any time with a long introduction. Bios are in the books. I introduced the panel just generally before the break. Frank Cilluffo, I hope you're on the line. We're ready to turn it over to you, man. War Eagle. And I got to mention that Frank is also on the board of advisors for Cyber Florida. So he's now become part of my adult supervision along with Mike McConnell. So good luck with that. Frank, over to you. Thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you so much, and War Eagle, and congratulations to the whole team at USF and to Cyber Florida for putting on a truly amazing event over the past couple days. Tons of blood, sweat, and tears goes into that, and I just want to say congratulations, and also to the team at NISA. I will not introduce the panelists either, other than to say you can't ask for a bigger and better rock star panel than we have to discuss cyber deterrence than Secretary Michael Chertoff, Admiral Mike McConnell, and General Dennis Crall. I mean, bottom line is it's looking at it from multiple perspectives, and all have led significant agencies that play major roles in dissuading, deterring, and compelling bad cyber behavior. I have to say, when people talk cyber deterrence these days, it's become a bit of a loaded issue. I think a lot of people immediately turn to, as Chris Inglis had raised earlier, nuclear deterrence. I think there are a lot of folks that say cyber deterrence can occur. What I hope to be able to do is maybe start with a question that sort of paints the landscape. It ultimately sets some baselines, and from my eyes, maybe slays a couple of straw men. I'm pretty biased on my views on cyber deterrence, and since I've got a judge on this panel, I promise I'll try not to lead the witness, so I'll keep my views to myself. But what I thought I'd do is start with the general question, and Secretary Chertoff, maybe start with you to sort of lay out what you think the key elements of a cyber deterrent, what cyber deterrents are, and some of the key issues, and then General Crall, Admiral McConnell, jump right in after Secretary Chertoff comments, and let's get the conversation going.
Great, thank you, Frank. And just, I want to plead guilty. I'm the former judge on the panel here. When I think of deterrence, I know my mind first goes to nuclear deterrence, and we can actually debate how effective that was, or whether we had some close calls. But it was basically an all or nothing proposition. First of all, there was no issue about attribution, really. And secondly, the expectation or the articulated doctrine was there wasn't going to be an attack of half a dozen nuclear bombs and a response of half a dozen. If once you crossed the Rubicon, you were going to be totally in a world of mass destruction. I don't think that applies here. To me, deterrence involves two related but distinct concepts. One is deterrence by denial. At a minimum, that means hardening your own defense infrastructure so as to make it difficult for an adversary to get in. The example I sometimes use is a auto thief in a car. A determined auto thief can get into a car even if it's got alarms and multiple locks and one of those clubs on the steering wheel, but it's going to be a lot harder than breaking into the car next to it that doesn't have any of that stuff. So in some ways, a strong defense is a deterrent. I think we could also argue that interception and warning are part of deterrence by denial. So if we see the adversary beginning to prepare to do something, and we either warn or we actually go in and interfere with the ability of the adversary to execute, I regard that as deterrence by denial, but it's kind of crossing a little bit into what they sometimes call active defense. And then there's deterrence through sanctions and punishment. And there, I think, a key concept I hope we come back to is proportionality. Because to me, espionage is a different animal than disrupting operational technology systems like your physical infrastructure. And that's different than doing something that actually winds up killing people. And so the response has to be proportional depending on which of these three categories you're dealing with. We wouldn't get kinetic over espionage. We never have in the past when it was done by human beings. So we wouldn't do it if it was done by cyber, but I would argue that if there was a cyber attack that cost another 9/11, we would consider a kinetic response, and that would be appropriate. So when I look at the range of things that are tools that could be used to come up with a proportionate punishment, there's obviously criminal prosecution. That usually doesn't work very well because you don't get you have to apprehend the criminal, but occasionally it does. We've been able to arrest someone or get them extradited. Sanctions, as we just saw President Biden level against the Russians based on what they've done. Leaking information. I mean, one of the things that we talked about briefly earlier is, if someone is doxing or putting out stolen emails and things to affect an election, maybe we want to expose the Russians or Russian people or Chinese people to some of what their governments hide, like where does Putin have his money, or what is Xi Jinping doing, in his spare time. And some of the stuff that's censored, we could actually try to push through. And then finally, there is the possibility of an attack on cyber infrastructure as part of the response if you're going to retaliate. And as I adverted to earlier, if you really had what I consider to be an act of war, which is an attack that results in significant loss of life, even though conducted in cyberspace, at that point, I think, as we've said, all bets are off, and we will respond as we would if someone launched, artillery or drop bombs. So, Frank, that's kind of my general roadmap of what I see as the range of options.
Awesome. Admiral, want to jump in, or General?
Well, let me start first. I would say that when we started this discussion or thinking about it originally, I'm afraid I was a little close to the nuclear point of view. It was kind of all or nothing. But and thinking about it, I've moved more toward the center of that argument. A lot of it just described by Judge Chertoff, and thank you for that, Judge Chertoff. I've always been a big fan. Listen to what you have to say. I think where I'm moving, the direction I'm moving into, is we have to be willing to respond. Maybe it's exposing the secrets of autocrats who are hiding them from their own citizens, but there has to be some element of capability to respond. But where I've sort of worked myself around, and I've thought about this part of the equation much more, it's cyber resilience. I think we as a nation have allowed ourselves rushing to embrace information technology. We are digitally dependent. And because of that digital dependence, we've introduced a level of vulnerability that's, I would say, perhaps unsurpassed in terms of just how vulnerable we are. And so if we're going to be dependent on this technology and we want to have some level of deterrence, we've got to give serious thought to making ourselves much more robust. And I say that by cyber resilience. And I don't mean just in the sense of securing the networks with better cryptography or something of that nature. In the course of this conference, what I found very useful to sort of open the issues and discuss it, something I had not thought as much about in the past is it's not software, it's not hardware, it's wetware. And if you just think about that for a second, it's the human being. It's mistakes by human beings not recognizing something that they're facing in the context of perhaps a criminal probe or something of that nature. So on one end of the spectrum, we need better technology and security and cryptography and authentication. All those kinds of things need to be considered and built in. On the other end, we need a more informed citizenry. And the observation I have, I've taken this new position with the executive director of Cyber Florida. A better way to say it, our official name is the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. So our mission is education and research and outreach across the state. So in trying to think about this problem, what I've come around to is if we're going to solve it long term, we got to start in secondary schools. I mean grade school. In addition to teaching the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, what about digital infrastructure, digital sphere, or how to behave in that space. We're dependent on it. And my analogy is driving an automobile. Virtually every adult, or at least in my era, drove an automobile to get to work or do whatever. And so you knew, as a part of growing up, a part of your education, you took instruction, whether it was from your parents or in school, about automobile safety, and you knew the rules of the road and that sort of thing. We don't have an understanding of safety or rules of the road for the cyber area. And so I think once I've tried to work my way through deterrence, I'm all for making us more resilient with hardware and software, but I think wetware, the human being, in terms of understanding and so on, is much more important than I realized in the past.
Admiral, and before I turn it to you, General, you raised a number of key points I hope we can discuss in a little bit. At the end of the day, there's someone behind the clickety-clack of the keyboard. So I think the connection between humans and technology is so important here. And General, again, I don't want to lead the witness, but at the end of the day, we do need to impose cost and consequence on bad cyber behavior. That's the only way you're going to induce changes in behavior. We're starting to see bits and pieces of that, but I'd really like to get some of your thoughts. I'm of the personal view, we need to be resilient, but we can't just firewall our way out of the problem either. At the end of the day, we need to be able to, I'm a big proponent of defend forward. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts there in terms of what the Department of Defense is thinking, persistent engagement, and whereas cyber is its own domain, it also transcends all the existing domains of air, land, sea, space. So we can't treat it as just a cyber issue. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think your comments are very accurate. And so I'll take maybe this in two parts. The first part, I think, that's pretty critical is I agree with those who spoke before me, and it's very well said. Here's where I take a stand on the traditional, more parochial definition of deterrence. Really does, I know there's deterrence by denial, and that was stated very clearly. And in many cases, we consider that cybersecurity, right? The idea of the car and the lock, et cetera. The challenge we have with that approach is, if we're talking about two automobiles parked next to each other and one is locked and one is unlocked, then clearly one becomes easier. But what if the car that had the lock on it was filled with $500 million? Then how realistic would the lock system be? And what would actually stop somebody from getting into that vehicle? If we're really looking at deterrence, meaning that there's some doubt or fear about the consequences, right? So the actor wouldn't even think about approaching that proper. And the challenge we have in this space is the risk reward calculation is so skewed. When you think about theft of intellectual property, theft of our acquisition in our systems and our programs, gaining this asymmetrical access into our power grids and water supply, the payoff for that is so high, and attribution in some cases becomes so complex that you really look at what is a good deterrent to have somebody not even think about taking those actions. And that becomes the real conundrum. So to your point, you talked about leading the witness. I think the witness was already there. We have to really take a stronger look at what are the lines, the red lines that the country has. We haven't established norms yet. I know when it came to election security, that's a good place to start because it's recent. And I believe our leaders put out some pretty strong notice. And that is, there's a difference between influence and interference. We expected influence, and we've seen it. We've seen manipulation of social media. We've seen evidence where adversaries were trying to stir up dissent and cause us to doubt our elections and doubt our leaders and doubt our democracy. We know that adversaries are very much involved in that space. But it would have been a different argument had we seen election interference, vote counting changes, breaking and hacking into voting systems, trying to manipulate the end of those and hijacking that process. But outside of that example, it's really hard to determine what normal state behavior and acceptable state behavior is. And I believe that's more of a policy issue. on, for example, we know that espionage takes place. We have people that spy, all around the world. And when people get caught, they normally exchange these individuals who do that business. It's a dirty business, but we've seen it. We debate sometimes whether, is spear phishing an acceptable behavior for, the United States to perform, for example, more rhetorical right now. And then all those things to gain access that would lead up chain. So to be honest, I'm not sure that a cyber on cyber deterrent model really works well. You've got to use those other instruments of power. And until we can determine where our red lines really are and have some examples of us demonstrating that power and being committed to it, I think, again, our adversaries look at the payoff in this space so high that presently we really only have deterrence by denial and hardening our systems as a real means to protect the information that we hold vital. And to the other point of your question on defending.
Yeah, I mean, can I just weigh in here?
Go ahead.
Now, I agree with you. I'd say there's one other variable we need to think about in terms of deterrence by punishment, which is what is the vulnerability of the adversary and what is the prospect of blowback? So I'll give you a concrete example. If you're thinking about the Russians, if you were to cut them off from the banking system, I mean, that would impose real punishment on some of the oligarchs and on Putin himself. Now, that might cause them to respond by attacking the banking system using cyber means. So you'd have to make sure you're not in a glass house throwing stones. If you're dealing with China and responding to them, that's a different set of concerns, because there we do have a lot of companies doing business in China. We've seen, as we saw with these two Canadians who were arrested by the Chinese, China is not at all hesitant in holding hostages. So again, part of the calibration here is not just how serious was the attack on us, but what kind of response will be sufficient to get their attention, but not result in actually having it then blow up in our own faces.
It's a great set of points. In general, I want to bring others into that as well. But the reality is we have not signaled our red lines, certainly for events under the traditional threshold of conflict and war. And I think that's the gray area that we're all somewhat struggling with. But I do think these are, and one thing I might note, the line between, which is very different than nuclear deterrence, the line between exploit and attack technically is non-existent. It's all hinging upon intent. So I do think that some of these mass CNE event, computer network exploit or espionage events, can have kinetic effect if the intent is there. So I don't mean to jump in, but those are really good points. And General, I think it actually supports your comments that we need red lines and we need to signal. Fair?
It is fair. And I'll tell you, in some of these cases, unlike kinetic attacks, we may never know. I know we've made great strides to partner with businesses to report attacks, but to shareholders, this is an unsavory business. So it's not just coming after, military targets or, our electrical grid or those things, but when they come after businesses in academia, you think about it. Businesses aren't real keen to show up and say, by the way, I was hacked, or I had this compromise, or I had this stolen. And I know, and again, I don't want to take away any of the efforts that the department has made great grounds, especially, in OSD and with Cybercom and some of these other elements we have. Reporting is up and people are sharing information better than they have before. So I think things are trending in the positive direction, but these are soft targets. And imagine if the victims are shy to report and shy to do this in a timely manner, that makes the targets even more lucrative. Because the likelihood of being outed, that's one. And the other aspect is name and shame is a different area now. I think our adversaries have no problem in many cases naming and shaming. They get named and they deny it and they move on. And the news cycle replaces that with the next new news event. So what used to be the big buildup of outing somebody seems to have fallen flat. They become conditioned and they just claim it didn't happen and they move on. So I agree with the comment that until and the comments about can you hold them accountable? Absolutely. And I think the earlier comments about, dependencies in those nations, but again, proportionality becomes a problem because that rheostat may be set differently. You had opened up the door a little bit about the idea of defend forward and our hunt teams and folks who do certain activities. All I will say is I think that those endeavors are absolutely needed. They've been executed very well, and there's certainly no harm with gaining insight and posturing yourselves forward into the machine so that you can see these in development and start to map that ecosystem better, which helps with attribution, but also goes back to helping with defense. So those have paid off. But again, I'd like to hear examples either from the audience or from this team where we've actually put fear or doubt into an adversary and they didn't act, or we think that maybe they didn't act because that we have very clear consequences that have been advertised and they're believable. I think we've got work to do in that area.
Well said.
I think,
Secretary, Admiral, please.
I was going to say, I think that's the key question. I'm a strong advocate of defend forward. I understand that. And I actually even think of it as from the U.S. intelligence community's point of view, we should not only defend forward, we should literally own at our discretion the foreign adversaries, potential adversaries network, so we can exploit at will. I happen to think espionage is a good thing for us, a good thing for our adversaries. Espionage lets each side sort of understand each other. So what I'm having difficulty with is how do you impose a consequence for espionage when both sides are doing it? Now, I'll make a distinction. Economic espionage, the United States does not do that. Economic espionage left unchecked over a longer period of time can be severely disabling for a free market economy like the United States. Here's my example. The Chinese, it's been described variously, but one commentator has said the greatest transfer of wealth in history. There are varying measures. I've heard $500 billion a year, or even more over time, of course, of intellectual capital and intellectual property going to China, so they have competitive advantage. And if you go back to the Clausewitz axiom, three kinds of power: military, political, and economic. The first two grow out of the last. So if they're going to be the world's largest economy, and they likely are, and they're doing that by taking intellectual property and software and business plans and results of research and development and so on, it gives them a competitive advantage. How do we deter that activity? How do you impose consequences on that activity?
Admiral, I think you raise a really key set of issues here. I mean, the bottom line is the private sector pays for the real and or perceived sins of others, right? That's the target. And at the end of the day, the private sector is not, as much as we've talked about public-private partnerships, it's still long on nouns and in my eyes, a little short on verbs in terms of actionable steps that can be taken. So I'm really happy you raised that point. The one thing, though, that I would leave you with, though, is you don't know necessarily once an incident and or a breach occurs, whether it's meant for espionage purposes or it's meant for future destructive and or disruptive purposes. And I think that is really complicating matters when we think about it. So, and Admiral, I don't mean to push back because I think your points are really well stated, but do you think that the SolarWinds breach demands a response, and what's proportional, what's commensurate? Do we think that since you guys opened the doors on this already, were the imposition of sanctions enough? Do we need to do more? Should this be overt? Because we need not only the Russians to know we're going to respond, but the Chinese, North Korea, Iran, everyone else who's watching to know that we're taking it seriously. I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are. And the flip side to that is what works in Moscow's case may not work in Beijing, which may not work in Pyongyang, which may not work in Tehran, which may not work in criminal enterprise ABCD, whatever it is. So Lots to discuss there, but Secretary Chertoff, you kind of opened this up, and after we sort of have a little discussion around this, I want to talk a little bit about authorities, whether some of the blind spots that General Nakasone is talking about, how we think we ought to get our arms around that. But before jumping on that, what do we think of the current imposition of sanctions? You're on mute.
Sorry, to go back to Admiral McConnell's point, I do think economic espionage is important. One way to respond to that, this doesn't work with criminals who are stealing money, but it does work with people who are stealing intellectual property, is if that intellectual property winds up getting deployed by a business enterprise in a place like China, you could then sanction the business enterprise for using stolen property, like a copyright violation or a patent violation, similar concept. And that actually would have an effect, because if you're Alibaba or some major global actor, and all of a sudden you're going to get whacked in the marketplace for using stolen intellectual property, that might actually have an effect. I think on solar winds, here's the challenge. And I agree, often an exploit like this could be used to steal intellectual property, to steal money, or actually do something more disruptive. So the question is, do you deter? What do you do for the mere potentiality of something? And then what do you do if someone executes on that potentiality? So obviously, if someone executes in a way that causes loss of life, then as I said, it's Katie bar the door. On the issue of simply creating the potential, I'm reluctant to say you take that as if it's tantamount to an act of war, because to me, it's a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis, positioning the missiles within striking distance of the US, but you haven't launched them yet. So you want to respond, but you don't necessarily want to treat it as if the attack's been launched. In this case, I think sanctions will have some effect, particularly if you focus on the people around the leadership of Russia that have a lot of money parked overseas and are going to be unhappy if they can't access it or travel to it. So it's not a perfect solution, but raising the cost to the Russians, if we're tough about it, I think does have some positive effect.
Admiral, you want to jump on that, General? I'm not sure you want to come in with an opinion on a policy, but please do if you're willing to.
My view is the sanctions approach for solar winds is appropriate. I remember both sides do this, and Frank, a point you made, I frequently make. The difference between exploitation and sabotage or degradation or destruction is only intent. If you can be in a system, remote control from overseas for exploit, then you also have the ability to destroy or contaminate. So if you'll recall, when solar winds happened and became public, many of our senior policy leaders started talking about it as an act of war. Well, clearly, on the face of it, initially, it's espionage, and we both do it. So the question is, what is it really, and how do we know? Based on at least my reading of what's in the press and the ebb and flow, is if I were making a recommendation to the president currently, it would be this proportional response of sanctions, but I would try to put emphasis on exposing the leadership, make them some consequence for the leadership, those who are directing these actions, and maybe that would put a damper on future activity.
You're here, and dare I say, on the heels of solar winds, you also had a significant hack on Microsoft Exchange, and another advanced persistent threat, in this case coming from China. So if we set precedents, we better be ready to, if we put red lines in the silicon, we better be willing to respond agnostically to the perpetrator. General, would you agree with that? I'm not going to put you on the policy question spot, but
No, I think that's fair. I mean, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I mean, but let's be fairly honest, there's a lot of tools available to us. And there's a lot of tools available to us we wouldn't talk openly about in this forum. So yes, some of this may be occurring in certain areas and some might not, but I do think that we have the ability, and some of this is still fairly new, and feeling out really where those red lines might be and what proportionality looks like. But you are right in the sense that every time one of these things takes place, precedent is being set. And if the goal in deterrence, by again, its conventional definition, is to cause fear or doubt, that means ambiguity increasing activities, when many of these things are actually driving ambiguity the other way, and perhaps conditioning people that this type of behavior is still worth the risk. And again, the payoffs for these things in some cases are very high for the adversary, especially in the theft of intellectual property. When you think about it, you can cut billions of dollars and years off research and development costs. So again, what do you put in place to thwart that? There's a lot of pain threshold for a payout that big.
Yeah, that's a very, very insightful and thoughtful comments on that. And I mean, one of my pet rocks is we've let the adversary define our strategy because we're always responding to an event. We should be shaping it the other way around in my eyes. So very, very thoughtful comments here. Please.
Frank, can I just make an observation?
You can always make an observation. Jump in whenever you want, especially you. You've got the floor at all times.
It's a benefit of age, but to go to General Crall's point of lots of tools, there was a point in life where I actually owned or controlled a lot of those tools. It was a Navy slice, there was a Director of NSA slice, and there was a DNI slice. I remember Title 50 and a different set of authorities. But here's my point. And as an intelligence officer, you're frequently right at the forefront of crisis. Something bad happens. What are you going to do? What are your response options? What do you really know? And so on. So a lot of my career has sort of been that part of it. And so frequently the questions asked, what are you going to do? And so those of us who knew about the tools or had the tools would always offer them up. And well, if you choose to, you pick your scenario, attack the money supply, turn off the electric power, whatever it might be. We never took one of those options. And the reason we never took one of those options is because in the coordination process, some agency always said, wait a minute, what's the secondary effect? What's the tertiary effect? We're more vulnerable. Secretary Chertoff used a term earlier. I've used myself and heard often, glass house. We were always hesitant to do something because we were uncertain or afraid of the consequence back because we were more vulnerable. And that's the point I'm trying to highlight. Now that lets me make a point I want to tee up in this opportunity for this panel. I've worked myself around to believing when you understand that the US government owns a very small percentage of what's important in the critical infrastructures or the information systems, most of it's owned in the private sector. And there's a huge gap between the two. I'm working myself around to thinking in terms of collective security. I think it has to be at network speeds. I think we have to be able to see malware, potential malware, metadata. You don't have to look at the content or the personally identifiable information or the business information. You look at the metadata and you exchange that at a level between the government and the private sector at network speed to raise our collective security as a nation. If it's a physical threat, we got the rules. The established organization and rules of the road and resources and plans and response options and so on. If something's approaching the United States to attack something in New York City, we'll defend it. If it's a cyber attack, well, we're not sure. So my way of thinking now is collective security. So we're more resilient. Once we're more resilient, we can go back to some of those tools that we were discussing as being response options to respond to someone, a foreign nation who did something we didn't want to happen again in the context of deterrence.
Very, very thoughtful. Secretary Chertoff, I mean, you would be the one who'd have to either preside over some of these cases, or given DHS and CISA's role and where all that fits in. I'd be curious what your thinking is there. And then very specifically, to get to the authorities question, that I almost feel like I'm reading the 9/11 Commission report again when I'm hearing the hot washes and after action of solar winds. It wasn't an issue of not being able to assess and evaluate and analyze the dots. It's the ability to collect the dots. So do we have another wall that needs to be broken down, or is the wall there for good reason?
Well, this is a really interesting and critical question, because I agree. One of the things, and I've said it in the past, even before solar winds, I was always concerned about was someone launches an attack on our critical infrastructure, cyber, sitting in a Starbucks and logging on somewhere in Washington, D.C., and it doesn't come from overseas directly. So I have to say there's a good argument to be made that the intelligence, some element of the intelligence agencies, whether it be the FBI or another agency, should have the authority to monitor and collect on cyber threats in the U.S. And I think this is very similar to the wall situation that impeded our ability prior to 9/11. And just to kind of put my personal patina on this, I was the head of the criminal division on September 11th, 2001 in Justice. And we were given temporary permission to bring the wall down, and I was able to look at the intel side of the house and discovered that there was quite a bit of intel that, had it been acted upon with criminal investigation, might have allowed further things to be uncovered. So I'm very sensitive to that frustration. However, I will also tell you that some of the measures we put into place to collect intelligence years later, when the threat had diminished, became highly controversial from a civil liberty standpoint. And were actually probably cut back further maybe than they should have been, because there was a reaction in the counter direction. So if you're going to create authorities to allow the intelligence community to collect on threats emanating from within the territorial U.S., but in cyberspace, you need to write a very careful piece of legislation with controls and supervision, so that you wouldn't wind up with getting the kind of reaction you see now to being required to wear a mask when you're out in public. And I think it's worth thinking about it, but it's something to be proceeded on in a very measured way.
General, do you want to weigh in? Admiral, I know you were DERNSA, so I think fair to say we know where the capabilities reside, and some of the authorities aren't there. How do you put that round circle into that square box?
Frank, I used to surprise my staff and my friends because I was a strong advocate for congressional oversight. I have a belief that would be shared by everyone, but a large bureaucracy, two characteristics of a large bureaucracy, left to its own, and there's need for change. A large bureaucracy will choose failure over change. It's one observation. The second is a large bureaucracy left to its own will redefine reality in its own self-interest and will eventually do things that it shouldn't be doing. And when I did the research going into the Director of NSA seat, I wanted to really understand FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. What was the history? Church Pike, the Watergate, all that sort of thing. So I went as far back as I could go. I was amazed at the transgressions of law enforcement and the U.S. intelligence community spying on Americans. Now, most of it was framed around the Nixon era, the Watergate, and so on. But when Congress did that review, they said, look, we need espionage. We got a Cold War. But we never again do we want this community to spy on Americans. And so the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was written in 1978, and it served us well. It's been modified along the way. One of the things, the missions that President Bush gave me when I was the DNI was, Mike, we got to get this legislation updated, corrected. And here's the reason. A terrorist in Pakistan talking to a terrorist in Turkey, coordinating an attack on a US facility in Germany, and our access point for that information was a server in California. But to take information off a server in California meant you had to have a warrant. And so these terrorists are smart, multiple email addresses, move around, change from one ISP or internet service provider to another. Therefore, we made the argument to the White House and to the Congress, why should the US intelligence community, so long as it's targeting a legitimate foreign target in a foreign country, and a second target in the other foreign country, why should we have to have a warrant? And surprised, the Congress agreed, and we modified that law. Now, because of Snowden and the perceptions that was created, there's been debate. I think it's called Section 708, if I remember it correctly. But my point is, oversight's required. The law is the way we govern. I agree with Secretary Chertoff's point. You have to be very careful how you frame that law. But I think we're at a point of digital dependence and digital vulnerability that if you have the world's best exploitation capability, NSA, notice I said exploitation, not attack or sabotage, but exploitation. If you've got the best capability, why wouldn't you look at the critical infrastructures, at least at the metadata, at least the behavioral analytics that would let you say, there is bad actor or some bad information, and you could warn everyone in the critical infrastructures to modify their networks or respond to it or improve their firewalls or focus it. Network management is very dynamic. And so I think where I'm going with this is I would advance an argument to allow the National Security Agency and others to look for warning. And then I would work the issue to make us more resilient as a nation, that you harness the best in the US government and the critical infrastructures to exchange information, at least metadata, so you can apply artificial intelligence, machine learning, behavioral analytics, whatever you need to apply to it, so you can see the things that shouldn't be there. And once you see them, you can do something about it. So that's how I'm thinking about reducing our vulnerability. At the same time, I know this panel is focusing on deterrence. At the same time, if you reduce our vulnerability, I think you could be much more aggressive in responding to activities from a foreign nation that we want to deter.
Very, very insightful, thoughtful. I think that the debate's going to be open on this issue for a while, especially since I think General Nakasone has publicly stated he didn't need new authority. So I definitely think you're hitting the crux of the issue. And I'm just not sure we have time in our panel to get to the answers, but
if I were still, Frank, if I were still on active duty in General Nakasone's seat, I would have given exactly the same answer. but now I'm not on active duty and I'm a private citizen, and I feel like advanced stage, I've observed a lot. So I'm just trying to make the point that we need to have that discussion. I don't know how it might turn out, but we need to have the discussion.
I think you're spot on. That is the crux of we eat around the edges of a lot of the discussion items, but I think that could be a key element to deterrence. We've just got a little bit of time left, and I want to just sort of leave with a couple of thoughts. In general, maybe we'll start with you. At the end of the day, are we deterring cyber, or are we deterring Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? You fill in the actor, whether it's an advanced persistent threat or not, from using cyber capabilities. And I'd be curious how you see the Department of Defense integrating into a larger whole of government. And dare I say, and I don't mean to be Pollyannish here, but the private sector has to be at the table, a whole of society kind of approach to these issues. So where do you think we are? And am I off on that? Or are we actually deterring cyber? But I can argue why I don't think that's the case, but I'd be curious what your thinking is.
So, clearly, I think that the honest answer is I don't know, because I'm not in the minds of our adversaries, certainly. What I would say is that It depends, can one deterrent work, for others? I had an older brother. I can just give you some anecdotal, place at home. I saw some lessons learned on him that worked for me. Where I learned from action because I saw what happened to him and I realized where my dad's red lines were very well and where my mother's red lines were very well. And so even though those actions weren't affecting me directly, when I saw it take place, I realized they're serious about these things and maybe I need to take a look at that. Maybe that's a bit simplistic and naive to think in this space that it works that way, but people are people and nations
Well
have
said.
risk. And I think they all watch and they all look and they all make their own individual risk reward calculations. And I don't think these things are static either. I think we can leverage things based on time. There are times when, certain adversaries we have are very vulnerable, where these tools, which wouldn't have worked under one condition because of other world conditions that have presented themselves, give us an opportunity to say, you know what, I didn't have this leverage against you 2 years ago, but now the world has changed and you've exposed the level of weakness here where we might be able to get this for a season or for a time. So I don't think these are just laid on the table and they rest. I think we have to be very active to make sure that we understand where there's opportunities to take and leverage these and where there's not. On the domestic side, I certainly respect the arguments made from those experienced looking in, but you talked about, others have to be at the table. Yeah, of course, our industrial complex and our businesses have to be at the table because we have vested interests in that. And they also cannot necessarily respond in the ways we can, right? We don't allow our businesses, for example, if a bank gets hacked, to launch a cyber attack on an adversary because the bank is upset, right? They're really limited in how they can respond globally to some of these threats. So they depend on both our domestic capabilities and our projected capabilities abroad to ensure that we make these things as safe as we know how to make them.
Well said. I might note, you brought up a point that hasn't been discussed here, is even the Department of Defense is dependent upon, from a mission assurance perspective, a lot of our critical infrastructure to deploy power, project power, deploy forces, move material, people, and you name it. So I'm glad you raised that critical set of issues, and I appreciate that significantly. Secretary Chertoff, any parting thoughts here? I think we actually had 10 more minutes. I thought we only had 1 more minute, so we can have some good, thoughtful.
I won't use the whole 10, but I agree with Admiral McConnell. I do think that there are probably ways we could think through how to monitor metadata that would not seriously compromise, the privacy of content, but would give you behavioral warning that there's something you need to take a closer look at. That's, of course, what we've done in the physical world with counterterrorism, although, again, perhaps with some encouragement by people with misinformation, that itself even became controversial and got scaled back. But I think there might be ways to do that. In terms of whom we're deterring, I guess look, the machines don't decide on their own to hack. People make that decision. And therefore, to me, the deterrence is focused on intent of the adversary. Criminals, all you have as leverage is you can arrest them and put them in jail, and that incapacitates them. Nation states are harder. And one issue we didn't talk about a lot was the standard of attribution. How clear do you have to be, and how much do you have to demonstrate publicly the basis of your attribution? And I think that's been a little bit, until recently, that's been a little bit of an obstacle to doing real deterrence. One thing that has happened lately, by the way, is the private sector on its own has publicized its attribution, which in a way has more credibility with the public and gets us by that immediate question of, well, how do we know who really did it? Because you do get a lot of deniability. I mean, even in the physical world, the Russians pretend that the men in little green uniforms in Ukraine are not somehow involved with Russia. And, that's not cyber, that's physical. So I think these are all, part of putting together a strategy. And it's been a great discussion.
Awesome. And I'm really glad you brought up attribution, because we're not where we hope to be, but we really have moved that needle quite a bit. I mean, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we had discussion, we'd all be in jail in terms of attributing some of these incidents to Russia, China, Iran, DPRK, you name it. So I hope that we see continued joint attribution through allies such as Five Eyes, NATO, and other important bilats. So, but we don't need to get down to the secret sauce, do we, where we'd be compromising our own capabilities. So, Admiral,
Frank, can I push back just a bit on?
I gave you the free pass every time you want. Jump in.
Okay, all right. Well, first I want to do the good news, and then I want to present a problem I think we have to think our way through. I got focused on this issue when I was the director of NSA, early 90s. Cold War's over. Internet's exploding, get smaller, so all the problems we had. And we turned our attention to how we're going to do signals intelligence for the future. The big surprise for us, man, it's easy. Old days, data in motion, right place, right antenna configuration, right, everything had to be just right. And all of a sudden with networks, it's not data in motion you have to worry about, you have the opportunity for data at rest. So you're good enough, you can ride a network, go in, take what you want, close it up, no fingerprints, and the adversary is none the wiser. So when we started to experience that, and the internet's exploding, and all of the US businesses, particularly banks and so on, are rushing to embrace, because of all the goodness, increased speed, better efficiency, more productivity, it was understandable that they would rush to embrace it, but no consideration for the vulnerabilities. So I started to worry about this and think about it. And so retired, private sector, opportunity to be on some panels, to ask questions and investigate maybe the path forward for the future. I asked a question. This is a Navy conference down in Annapolis. I said, if there's a physical attack coming to New York City, it's going to threaten, what's the responsibility of the Navy and the Coast Guard? Laid out the answers, no question. I said, well, wait a minute. What if there's an attack on a bank in New York City, one of the major banks that does clearing? I said, what's the responsibility of the U.S. Navy? The answer was nothing. That's not our responsibility. We project power. So that was the starting point. Now, over time, this argument's progressed a little bit. Let me go to the 2011 attacks by Iran, initially on the Bank of America, then other banks, denial of service attacks mostly. And so the banking community, I was a consultant working for some of them, turned to the administration and said, this is a nation state attacking us. What are you going to do about it? And the answer was, you're on your own. So yep. I think we are coming to the point, this question was asked during this conference, we're coming around to the point that the US government's responsibility is to protect the nation from physical attack and from cyber attack. If a bank is attacked by a nation state, the government has a responsibility to weigh in and protect it. So now, that said, I think we're making progress. It's been very slow, but let me tee up the point that you raised that I think we're going to have to think our way through. It sounds like I'm teeing up the hard problems.
That's good.
The security rules that we live by come from Enigma and breaking Japanese codes. This is World War II. U.S. If you haven't studied the history of the U.S. intelligence community, here's a thumbnail. We're never ready. We've never sustained a U.S. intelligence community in our history. We don't like spies. We're flat-footed for World War I. We're flat-footed for World War II. After World War II, we decided, hey, this thing's kind of important. We do have the Cold War. Maybe we should sustain it. So in World War II, we collaborated with the British. We're breaking German Enigma, Nazi Germany Enigma codes, and we're reading them before the German field commanders. Churchill said at the end of that, it shortened the war by at least 2 years and probably saved 10 to 12 million lives. That's pretty significant. Meantime, the Army and the Navy collaborating together broke Japanese code in the Pacific, And using that advantage, they were able to defeat the Japanese armada that was going to invade Midway post Pearl Harbor with an inferior force, and they dominated. So all of a sudden, code breaking was pretty important, and the rules that were written for World War II rolled into the Cold War. I would argue we now have a bureaucracy that enforces those rules religiously, and everybody is trained, protect sources and methods. I believe we're at a point with digital dependency in a shrunken globe due to the information technology that we use and benefit from, but also makes us more vulnerable. We need to rethink those security rules. I believe if there is a nation state attacking, you pick your company, General Motors, Hewlett Packard, Google, whoever it is, and the US government knows that, they have a responsibility to report that information, get it to them as quickly as possible, regardless of the classification. If you take a step back and look at the critical infrastructures, these are the things that make the nation work today: finance, transportation, electric power, energy. So if we know something is being attacked or is going to be subverted or damaged in some way, why would we not tell them? I mean, look at the downside of not telling them versus did we compromise a source or a method? It's not magic how we know what we know. If you read any of the current literature and the articles written about it, it's no secret how you do espionage. It's no secret. And I'll give you one last anecdote, and I promise I'll shut up. New director of NSA, and I said, we ought to be proud of this place. Let's put a sign up out front. So put a sign up, says National Security Agency. They hung me in effigy because you can't say that. I said, well, who do you think we're hiding it from? The Russians know we're here. The bad guys know we're here. We're hiding it from a local US citizens. They should know who we are and what we do. So we've got to get over this mindset of so much emphasis on protecting sources and methods when we need to be thinking about protecting the country.
Admiral, I'm going to term you the new cyber Aristotle. Those are really thoughtful and important questions, no joke, because one of my favorite quotes was Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, whereas history may not repeat itself, it tends to rhyme. And here's the reality. Cyber is new. Human nature is pretty darn consistent. They're just using a new vehicle to achieve historically what we've seen in other domains as well. And I might just note, you would be biased saying this, but SIGINT really did win not only World War II, probably the Cold War, even the Revolutionary War in some ways. So bottom line is this is today's SIGINT one way or another. And all I do know for sure is we got to be out in front of this before our adversaries are. So so much more to discuss. And I'm going to just slay my one little, I probably biased it a little bit too much already, but I don't think we can ever be 100%. We're never going to prevent everything, everywhere, all the time from every perpetrator and every modality of cyber attack. The bottom line is that doesn't mean cyber deterrence isn't important or even isn't working. Ultimately, we're never going to be, if we're aiming for 100% checkmate, we've lost before we've started. So I just feel like the academic community has done a little too much intellectual gymnastics on some of the terminology. And with that, I want to turn it back over to you, Admiral. You and your team deserve yeoman's work for an amazing conversation. And General Crall, Secretary Chertoff, Admiral McConnell, thank you. Love the panel, love the discussion. It could have gone on for another hour, so or many more hours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Frank.
Thanks very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Secretary Chertoff, Frank, General Crall, thank you for your participation. It's been a great 2 days. We've got some very positive feedback. In my mind, you three are national treasures. We thank you for what you do, and we look forward to keeping the dialogue and cooperating. This is a democracy. We have to debate issues and argue about the way forward. But clearly we need to address this, and hopefully conferences like this will expose the ideas and the questions, and we'll be able to address them going forward. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Great.